that first was spoken about by David and then taken up on the lips of Christ, and that he went through that for our sake. Powerful psalm. We live in a culture of fame. Many people in our culture thinking often that the most important, most valuable people, the most impactful people are those who are the most well-known. People usually think of a handful of things when they think of famous people: actors or musicians or athletes or politicians, or people who are super wealthy and who desire to use their money as a power play to influence culture and always have their names in the newspapers. But I want you to think this morning, as much as you may enjoy music or movies or sports, even as much as the rare story or song might have impacted your life, who is it that has really impacted your life the most? Who are the small group of people who have really made you who you are? Who have touched your soul and impacted you at deep and profound levels? And why do you think these people have made such an impact on you? Please open your Bibles with me to Luke 6:12 through 16. Luke 6:12 through 16, as we continue to work through this amazing book of Luke. Luke writes, "In these days he went out to the mountain to pray, and all night he continued in prayer to God. And when day came, he called his disciples and chose from them 12, whom he named apostles: Simon, whom he named Peter, and Andrew his brother, James and John, Philip and Bartholomew, and Matthew and Thomas, and James the son of Alphaeus, and Simon, who is called the Zealot, and Judas the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor." In this short and simple passage, we see a small group of the most influential people of all time. People who are far more famous and powerful and impactful than any other person other than Christ has been or will be. It doesn't matter whether we think of people who have made an impact for good or for bad, or what field we are talking about, the arts or sports or politicians. Whether we mention famous names like Beethoven or Babe Ruth, George Washington or Isaac Newton, or on the negative side in my mind, people like Darwin or Marx, or the long list of evil dictators that have destroyed so many people. These men in this simple list this morning have, as the cliche goes, turned the world upside down as God worked in them and through them. What Jesus began, he carried on and eventually expanded through these men, which is why he said they would do greater things. And today, God wants to work through each one of us to carry on what he continued through these men. To some, that might seem overwhelming, but it is actually meant to encourage and to excite and to show that you are far more important, and God has much bigger plans in mind for each of us and for our church than we usually think or dream, and so much more important than what usually makes the news. Luke tells us in these days Jesus went onto the mountain to pray. Here Luke begins to show us a shift that is taking place in the focus of Jesus' efforts. A shift in his ministry as he begins to spend more time and more energy with those who believe, with his disciples, and especially with his now apostles, who will be the future leaders of the church, to carry on what he started. This is an important shift culminating in Matthew chapter 12, where the Pharisees officially and corporately denounced the work of Jesus as a work of Satan. And so from that point on, Jesus really shifts to his apostles to carry on the work that he is doing. In this section, he is getting ready to choose who he will spend the majority of his time preparing. This is one of the biggest and most important decisions that Jesus will make. As he shifts to this, he shifts to a second stage of ministry with the goal of impacting the world, a goal God had from the beginning, revealed with Abraham. We are told that he begins with prayer, talking to his Father. Prayer was a normal part of his life and ministry, but here it is different. This is a special time of prayer, different from his day-to-day prayer. He went out and spent all night, it says, in prayer. He went out at some point during the day, and then he pulled an all-nighter. He prayed all the way through to the day, so that means he spent at least 9 hours, maybe 10 hours in prayer. I wonder how many of us have ever pulled an all-nighter for any reason before. Usually this is a college thing, the night before a paper is due, or the night before a large exam. People who haven't gotten their work done or prepared well in advance will stay up all night cramming as much as they think they can into their brain, usually only to be so tired the next day that they don't do so well and everything doesn't really come spilling out. Or it is the stuff of kids' sleepover parties or youth group lock-ins, where usually at least a few kids or students decide that they're going to stay up the entire night and watch movies or play games. Usually once they get home the next day, they crash and wish that they didn't do it. Most people hate losing even an hour or two of sleep in any given night, let alone losing the entire night of sleep. But Jesus chooses to stay up all night, which shows how important that this is. He just came off a time of doing battle with the Pharisees, and this would have been draining for him, debating with them, teaching them, wrestling for the souls of people. It can be very draining physically and mentally and emotionally. And I'm sure that was a part of the purpose of his time with his Father, was to give him spiritual rest. It is ironic that to get one type of rest, he forgoes another type of rest. But this wasn't the main reason why he pulls this all-nighter. Part of the reason was that he was getting ready to make one of the most important choices of his life. If you were a business owner and you had spent your whole life creating and building up your business and sustaining it, if your business supported many different families and provided them with a way of having income, you would want to think long and hard before passing that on to another person, knowing that they could either build upon your work and carry on your legacy or bring it to a grinding halt. At this point, Jesus had numerous disciples, and in his humanity, he wanted to make sure that he was choosing the right people. The people that the Father and the Spirit were leading him to, bringing the Father and the Spirit into all of his choices, but especially ones of such lasting impact. But that is not even the main reason for his long period of prayer either. He is getting ready to delegate authority and ministry to other people, thus bringing upon them the same opposition that he had. Opposition from Satan that began right after Jesus' birth, where Satan tried to make short work of the ministry of Jesus, of course trying to kill him through Herod. Opposition that carried on into the desert temptation, where Satan again tried to make short work of Jesus, trying to tempt him to jump off of a high building and hoping that that would end his life, inciting him to throw himself off the pinnacle of the temple. Opposition from the religious leaders as well, who plotted and planned, and he knew would eventually be a part of God's plan for him to go to the cross. So he is praying for the ones that he is getting ready to choose, undoubtedly praying for their faith to grow and be strengthened, praying for their wisdom and their ability to navigate these tough waters, the ability to love and forgive all people, so that they could carry the gospel forward and people would see Jesus and see the truth of the gospel instead of have these men wreck it. Have any of you ever spent a whole night in prayer before? Or had such an important choice to make that you had to spend a lengthy period of time in prayer talking with your Father? Do we have the attitude of Jesus where we constantly pray, but especially in big and important life-changing decisions that we have to run to our Father? Or do we find it easier to talk to a friend for hours about an important matter? Jesus has opened the way for all of us to learn to cultivate this type of relationship, and it takes cultivation. It doesn't just happen. Where we rely on him and he works through it. Prayer is a discipline that takes practice, and many Christians can't even imagine praying for an hour, let alone praying for this period of time. But are we working up to it? It is not meant to make us guilty. It is meant to make us see what we can have and to strive for that goal. Are we even working our muscles out in prayer? Even working toward a goal? Do we even see this as a privilege this morning? Here we see two important ingredients in being a person who is used by God to carry on his ministry of turning the world upside down. We see first that we need to be people of prayer. But first, even before that, we see knowing that we are covered in prayer by our Savior, as he covered them, that is where we must start. This verse shows us that before Jesus called his apostles, he spent the whole night in prayer for them. We see this concept again in what is often called Jesus' high priestly prayer in John 17. Just before Jesus was betrayed and went to the cross, one of the last things he did was pray. In verses 9 through 19 of John 17, he tells us at this point that he is praying for Christians. There's the shift again, moving away from focusing on everyone at this point to a focus on believers who would carry on his work. And he prays that the Father would guard them because he knows the world hates them as it hates him, that Satan hates them. He prays that God would sanctify them or set them apart and grow their faith and strengthen them through the scriptures, and that they would then go out into the world as sent ones who would be world changers. But then he prays in verses 20 through 21, I do not ask for these only, but also for those who will believe in me through their word, and that is you and me. That they may all be one, just as you, Father, are in me and I in you, that they may also be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. So we see that he wants us to go out. We see that he wants to use us to impact the world. But he doesn't start by saying just pull up your bootstraps or try harder or learn more facts. Those things might be important, or try some new method. But the very first place that we must rest is in the fact that he is praying for us. Jesus prayed for you and me, for all those who would believe in the future, because of the ministry that he was first giving to the apostles, and then the ministry that he gives to each of us and wants to work through us. So he prays for our future world changing. He also includes us in this future believers section of this prayer. What he is saying is that he will continue to minister. He will carry on what he started through us. Therein was the apostles' strength to turn the world upside down. And therein we find our strength. In a prayerful relationship with him, relying on him, and knowing that it is he who is working through us, and he that is covering us in prayer. No matter what type of world-changing or disciple-making we are called to in each of the seasons of life that we go through, God is there, and he is the one carrying it out. For some, it is the call to make disciples through full-time vocational ministry. For others, at a season of life, it may be hard to see how God is using you. It is primarily through raising up of kids to follow Jesus and being open to talking to your family or your neighbors. We all have a different call at different seasons in our life. But we are all called to make an impact and to be world changers. And it starts with knowing that we are not only called to prayer, but that we are being prayed for. Romans 8:34 tells us that Christ is in heaven, even at this moment, interceding for all who belong to him. And if you stop and think about that, and you really let that sink in, that is incredibly empowering for ministry. So if he prayed for all of us and still prays for all of us and wants to use every one of us to carry his work forward, why is he spending a whole night in prayer? Why is he making such a big deal out of choosing the 12 apostles? Well, many people today, we use the words disciple and apostle almost interchangeably. Some people today even call themselves apostles, but there's a big difference between the two. And though we are called and gifted for service, there are no apostles that exist today. The Greek word disciple, mathetos, means a student or a learner or a follower. Every single one of us is called to be just that. It referred to someone who followed a certain teacher or a rabbinic school of thought. It was common in their day, in their culture. John the Baptist had disciples. And the Jewish rabbis often had disciples who sat under their teaching. And we have seen this recently as we're working through the book of Luke, when the Pharisees come and ask, why is it that your disciples act one way and our disciples act another? Why is it they don't fast? A disciple was seen as a positive thing, but it also had lowly aspects attached to it as well. Because these students were not charged a fee in their culture to sit at the feet of a teacher, so a rabbi could require their students to serve them, giving them all kinds of tasks, including lowly tasks. But as we've already learned, they could never make them wash their feet, because that was reserved for the lowest in society, such as slaves. So a disciple was not only viewed as a student who followed a way of life, but a lowly servant as well. At this time, Jesus had many disciples. We're not given a specific number, but we see that there are vast crowds of people who come to him regularly. Surely many of them would have considered themselves his disciples or followers. Though there is a distinction that we begin to see more and more as we work through the Gospels between those who are the masses and those who are the regulars. We see this in Luke chapter 10, before another shift in his ministry, where Jesus sends out 72 disciples ahead of each town that he is preparing to go to, giving those 72 disciples some authority, even some supernatural ability to heal. But it is different from the masses, and it is also different from the apostles. He doesn't give them as much authority as he gives the apostles. The word apostle comes from the Greek word apostolos, which means a delegate, a messenger sent out or sent forth with orders. It is similar to the way we would use the word agent or an ambassador. This is different from a student or a general follower. It is used almost every time in the New Testament to mean a specific office that a person holds, and that they have as much authority or delegated authority as the very person that they're representing. In their culture or day, if someone was sent out in this kind of role, they could actually purchase things or purchase property on behalf of somebody, and it was a binding contract for the person that they represented. So Jesus chooses 12. They didn't sign up for it. He chose them to become an apostle. There were qualifications for becoming an apostle, which we see in Acts chapter 1, verses 20 through 26. Let us take another for his office, speaking, of course, of Judas Iscariot after his death. So one of the men who have accompanied us during all the time from the Lord Jesus went in and went out among us, beginning from the baptism of John until the day that he was taken up from us. One of these men must become with us a witness to his resurrection. And they put forward two: Joseph, called Barsabbas, who was also called Justus, and Matthias. And they prayed and said, "You, Lord, know the hearts of all. Show which of these two you have chosen to take the place in this ministry of apostleship, from which Judas turned aside to go to his own place." And they cast lots for them, and the lot fell on Matthias, and he was numbered with the 11 apostles. So they were both disciples, but only one becomes an apostle and has the office of an apostle. The context, of course, is talking here about Judas, who just ended his life. And so there are only 11, and they are led to replace him and bring the count back up to 12, showing that this is an antitype of the 12 tribes, and showing that God is doing a new work as well. We don't have time to dive into that, but there's a lot of significance to this number here, showing that God is doing a new covenantal work. Before they replace Judas, Peter gives 3 requirements for holding the office. The person must have followed Jesus during his entire earthly ministry. The person was required to have seen the risen Lord Jesus, and the person must have been appointed or chosen as well by God. The first 2 requirements are simple and clear in what Peter said in these verses in Acts. But since this took place after Jesus ascended to heaven, recognizing that the choice was made by God is a little bit less clear. Peter's choice was accomplished through prayer and casting of lots, sort of like picking the shortest straw or rolling dice, having faith that God was the one who sovereignly caused the lot to fall on the right person, as with the Urim or Thummim, as we see in Exodus chapter 28. Something that we're not called to do today, that came to a close, but that was used here at the close and in this transitionary period of time. Though, of course, there are some clear differences between the Urim and Thummim, they were both a clear, certain, mechanical means of revelation, a way of showing clearly what God wanted, so that through this means we see the people who held the office of apostle were chosen by God. A quick point is worth mentioning that these are all qualifications that make it clear that there is no apostle today, except for Christ, who is the ultimate apostle. Hebrews 3:1 calls him our apostle and high priest. Otherwise, this would have been a temporary office completely. In the Old Testament, the primary offices that existed were the prophet, the priest, and the king. 3 offices that Jesus held and fulfilled perfectly. In the New Testament, the primary offices are elder and deacon. But in this transition time, Jesus created the office of apostle, which was specifically created in order to spread the gospel, to write the scriptures, and to initially set up and spread the church all around the world, which included as a part of their job description, choosing elders and deacons, which were the offices that God intended to remain perpetually. The offices he chose to then uphold his church until he returns. Offices that in many ways bring together and carry on the old offices of prophet, priest, and king, and carry on the delegated authority, but that do not have the unique authority or power that only the office of apostle has. They do not carry with it the ability to speak with the same authority that the apostles wrote the scriptures, or the power to heal or to raise the dead. Biblically speaking, there is a strict use and a broad use of this term. The strict use refers to the office that initially had 12 people, but then after Judas' death, Matthias is the replacement. And later, it broadens some with the Apostle Paul, who met the Lord on the road to Damascus and was chosen by Jesus and added to their number. But we see, as he says, he was one abnormally born. In other words, he didn't fit that first qualification, but Jesus himself overrode that first qualification and chose him, as he says in 1 Corinthians 15:8. In a broad sense, there were people who the Bible uses the word apostle with who do not hold the office, almost like having a small a instead of a capital A. The word is used in only a few rare occasions because the word has the idea of being sent out, and this is seen when a church leader is sent out who is closely associated with an official apostle. We see this in Acts 14:14 with Barnabas, in Galatians 1:19 with James, the half-brother of Jesus, with Timothy, Silas, and Apollos, and is debatable but possible in Romans 16:7 with Andronicus and Junia as well. But even though Acts and Paul use this term in a broad sense, it was used sparingly, and always of those who were closely associated with the Apostle Paul, who held that official office. This is similar to how we view the people who had the calling and authority to write the New Testament. They were all either apostles or authorized by apostles and under the leadership of an apostle, closely connected. So Mark and Luke, as we're studying Luke, and the author of the book of Hebrews, who I believe was Apollos, although that's debatable, are associated with Peter and Paul. But biblically, we never see the word used as liberally as some do today. It is never applied to all believers, as the word disciple is meant to be applied to every one of us. The word disciple is meant to be applied to every Christian, but apostle is not. Nor is it even applied to all the leadership of the church. It is not a word that is interchangeable, such as we use the Greek word presbyteros today when we talk about pastor or elder or bishop or presbyter, all referring to one office. So when people take this title for themselves today, it is confusing at best or completely misused at worst. Some using it almost the same as we use the word pastor or elder. Others using it actually to mean that they have the same power and authority that was given to the 12 apostles, which is dangerously wrong. Some churches today will use the term apostle for its leaders, some changing it from an office to a gift. But those two things are quite different. A gift is a divine grace, a special endowment meant for the gathering and the perfecting of the saints, for the building up of the church, not for initially setting it up, like the apostles did. We see a representative list of these gifts in places like 1 Corinthians 12 or Romans chapter 12. Things like having a special ability and heart for service, teaching and evangelism, encouraging and giving, acts of mercy and hospitality. It is an ability to express or communicate Christ in a way that builds up or strengthens the faith of other Christians and is meant to enlarge the church. They are special abilities of speech or action. And then there are the special categories of gifts, often called the charismatic gifts, the ability to heal or raise the dead as Jesus gave to the 12 apostles, which Matthew 10 brings out as a part of our story for today, or the ability to speak in different known languages, which took place at Pentecost in Acts chapter 2. In order to spread the good news of the resurrection to people who spoke different foreign languages, showing a reversal of the Tower of Babel right after the resurrection happened. But these gifts are a category all their own, given in 3 distinct periods of time, with hundreds of years in between where they don't show up in the Bible. Given at the start of new scriptural revelation, meant to validate the person that God was using to write the scriptures and meant to validate the scriptures themselves. So they show up in the time of Moses, who wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, and at the beginning of the office of prophet with Elijah and Elijah. And then they show up here with Jesus and the apostles at the start of the New Testament and those who wrote the New Testament. These are meant to be different gifts, meant to make a person stand out, to authenticate and validate that God was speaking through them in a unique way to write the scriptures. And since the canon is closed, there is no more need for this. And we see this focus die out even in the New Testament, even in the time of Paul, who was given miraculous gifts. Whereas later on in his ministry, he is unable to heal people like Trophimus or Timothy. And the need to validate the Messiah or those writing the scriptures ceased. And it is clear that we do not have people today who are able to raise the dead or do what Jesus and his chosen apostles were able to do. This was a unique part of the office of apostle, meant to validate them. But gifts are different from an office, which is a specific position with specific duties and requirements that comes with specific authority and responsibility. So a person might have the gift of teaching, but not be called to the office of pastor or teacher, but use it in a different way. But sometimes there is a close connection between the two, because sometimes the one is often given the ability to carry out the office that they were given. They were given these gifts to do that. But people are given gifts in a general sense as well, without a specific office. So Christ bestows a gift on every Christian and expects us to use them, but not all are called to a specific office. It is also important because the Catholic Church says that the office of apostle is carried on in succession with the Pope. But this is not the case, as we see that the office of apostle appointed elders to lead the church and carry on, not appointing other apostles. And both coexisted at the same time, having different roles and different duties. So the one is not a continuation of the other. It seems that Jesus chose his 12 apostles out of this larger group of 72 disciples that he later sends out. Maybe there were more there that day, but we see this in Luke chapter 10, that there were at least that many disciples who at this point were regularly with him, who were impacting other people through their witness, through their following and learning and faith, showing that though we are all called to follow and serve and use our gifts and impact others, we're not all called in the same way. So verse 13 says, he called his disciples and chose from them 12 whom he named apostles. So there were many that day, but only 12 were chosen and ordained to this specific office. As we look at the list of names Luke gives, we notice a number of important things. First, though you may have some familiarity with this list of names, so that no name sounds unfamiliar to you, you've heard it before, we know a lot more about some people on this list than others. But whether well known or not, they all turned the world upside down, making such an impact that the church spread to many countries, and they were so hated as Christ was that 10 out of 12 were martyred for their faith. The list of names can be a little confusing because the list differs slightly between Matthew, Mark, and Luke's gospel. This is due to the fact that many people in their culture had more than one name. Peter, who is called Simon until Jesus gives him the name Cephas, or Peter, in Matthew 16:8, meaning rock because of his great statement of faith that Jesus was the Messiah, is the first on the list for all three of the gospel writers. He is the author of 1st and 2nd Peter and is one of the three who were the closest to Jesus. In many ways, the leader of the rest of the 12, which is why Matthew in his gospel not only lists him first, as all three do, but calls him the first apostle. He doesn't mean that he was the first convert or the first to follow Jesus, because actually his little brother Andrew was. But it means that he is a leader among leaders. His leadership impacting so many people that Jerome tells us he was crucified, but thinking he was unworthy of dying in the same manner as his Lord, he was crucified upside down. Andrew was the brother of Peter. He was the first follower of Jesus. He was also at first a follower of John the Baptist, and we are told that he led Peter to Jesus. He was constantly inviting people to know and to trust Jesus, and history tells us that he did this all over the place, that he actually spread the gospel to Ethiopia, where he was also crucified on a cross, where he was tortured for 3 days, but where he said his whole life was lived for the cross. And when he saw the cross before him and knew that that was his destiny, that he came to it with joy, knowing how it impacted him and hoping that his death would impact others. James and John were brothers who were in a fishing partnership with Peter and Andrew and their father, and they gave up a prosperous business and life of comfort and were turned into fishers of men instead. They were so zealous for Christ that they were called the sons of thunder in Luke 9:54 after wanting to call down fire from heaven on a village that rejected Jesus and the gospel because they loved him so much. And even though they were misguided, we see their zeal and their passion in this. But later, that zeal is changed and sanctified and grown up. And instead of for calling down fire on people, they call for forgiveness for people who harmed them. James, the first of the apostles to be martyred, being beheaded, impacted the world by calling for God to forgive those who betrayed him in his final moments, calling for forgiveness of his killers right at the very end. John, being the only apostle other than Judas Iscariot who was not martyred, they were attempting to martyr him. They were going to boil him in oil, but it was never carried out. Instead, they banished him to the island of Patmos, a type of island prison. Philip, who introduced Nathanael, who is also called Bartholomew, to Jesus, was a first disciple of John the Baptist as well. And history tells us he traveled all the way to Turkey and to France with the gospel, making such an impact that they hated him as well, so much that they stoned him. And then when that didn't quite work, they crucified him to finish the job. Nathanael, or Bartholomew, who asked initially, "Can anything good come from Nazareth?" found the one from Nazareth so good. He is the one that not very much is recorded about in the Gospels, but still impacted the world. History tells us that he spread the gospel first to Armenia and then on to India, and translated the Gospel of Matthew into the language of India, taking on pagan religion out of love for people who are so different from him. Loving beyond his initial prejudice of people from Nazareth, prejudice with his own people, God changed into a love for everyone that he would take it all the way to India, where he would die for the very people that he loved, first being whipped so badly that they called it filleting the skin off of him before they crucified him. And when that didn't work, they beheaded him. Levi, also called Matthew, who we read about a few weeks ago, was a hated tax collector, one who was viewed as a traitor by his people for working with the Roman enemy who took over Israel. He was so changed and impacted by the gospel himself. He went from spreading hate by his actions to spreading the love of Christ through writing the gospel that bears his name and then taking that gospel to Ethiopia and to Egypt, where he was run through with a spear. Thomas, called Didymus or Twin, known most to people as a doubter, became such a believer after the resurrection and seeing Jesus face to face that history tells us he spread the gospel to Persia and then on to India himself and was also killed with a spear. James, the other James, there are a few James here, the son of Alphaeus, might have been related to Matthew as they are both related to Alphaeus. It could be either son or brother of here. Spread the gospel to Syria and made the religious leaders so uncomfortable, like his Lord, that they pushed him off the pinnacle of the temple. And when that didn't kill him, they stoned him. But in his last moments before the stones killed him, he cried out for God to forgive those who were killing him. And so many were convinced of the gospel at that moment that the religious leaders regretted making a public spectacle of him and wished that they killed him in private because so many people converted to Christ. Simon the Zealot, also called the Cananean, which is Aramaic for zealots. Zealots were a radical political group who wanted to overthrow Rome by force, even violent force. He became a zealot for Jesus, wanting to overthrow the kingdom of darkness and advance the kingdom of Christ. And history tells us he took the gospel the furthest, all the way to Britain, to Spain, and throughout North Africa before being crucified. And Judas, the son of James, also called Thaddeus, preached the gospel in Libya and Syria before being killed. So we see these common men all entered into the hall of faith in Hebrews chapter 11, impacting the world in their life and in their death, because they were so impacted by the love of Christ, by his life and by his death, that they looked at every interaction, every person, as an opportunity to make some kind of gospel impact for Christ. That doesn't necessarily mean that they shared the gospel in its full sense with every single person, but as we look through the early church history and what it says about them, we see clearly that they looked at every interaction as an opportunity to advance or further the kingdom in some way. It's amazing. These simple people, these largely uneducated people, have impacted the world more than any famous or educated or wealthy person. And the gospel wasn't just for big names, for the well-known or the apostles, but it was for those that we know little about, showing what is possible for all of us. It's not just the Peters and the Pauls, it's also the Judases and the Simon the Zealots who took it all the way to places like Britain. And so we can see that God wants to use each of us. And we don't always have to be the smartest or the strongest or the most famous. It is not that we all have to be foreign missionaries, but God wants to be a part of every normal moment, every conversation, every interaction with every person that we have. Do we look at each person from this lens? Do we want to be known even in this way at all? Is it even our goal in life? Do you ever pray about that? Do you ever think, who can I be praying for specifically by name, and then look for opportunities to model and to share the gospel? It's amazing not only who God uses to carry on his ministry and to work through largely uneducated fishermen, a hated trader and tax collector, people from Galilee. And Galilee was that part of the country that was looked down upon, but also who he brings together into one group. To work together as a church family, just like he has done for us. Jesus heals old wounds and brings together Matthew, and I love this, the former tax collector, who everyone would have viewed as a traitor, willing to sell out God, willing to sell out their people and their country, willing to work for the enemy of Rome who had taken over Israel, someone who they would have thought of as a thug, who not only stole money from people, but they would have viewed like the mafia because they could carry out their job with violence. And Jesus brings him into the same group that he brings Simon the Zealot, a man who hated Rome, a man who hated anyone who would have sided with Rome, a man who even believed in using violence against those who sided with Rome. In the world, this would have been two men who hated each other. And today, if you think about it like two opposing gang members, you're starting to get the picture. And God brings them into the same small group of 12 people and teaches them to love each other, to forgive each other, and to impact the world in a new way. And through this, we see the power of the gospel and the demands of the gospel that it places in our life. The church must never permit things like bitterness or a lack of forgiveness. We will step on each other's toes. We will offend each other. We will hurt each other, but we must never, ever allow a root of bitterness to take a hold of our hearts. We must always forgive each other and view each other as family. We must never allow hatred or thinking that one person is better than another person or pushing each other away because maybe we don't quite agree on some doctrinal points. We are family, and the church must never allow for that, and we see that in this picture, this beautiful picture of who God brings together. We must never allow for things like gossip or backbiting. Rather, we are all called to love Christ together and to impact the world together. So not only are we sent out as individuals, who can you be praying for? Who can you be impacting? But bring that to our prayer time. Be sharing that with each other, who you want to impact, so that we are lifting each other up and praying for each other, encouraging each other. Or maybe you have a conversation with somebody and you don't know the answer to a question that they bring up. Come and bring that to the discussion, to the church, so we have a way of helping each other out and guiding each other in this ministry that he is calling us to. Will you be an influential person for Christ as he wants us all to be? In our own circle of influence, there are no more apostles, but there are world changers. And even if you don't think of yourself this way, united to Christ, the ultimate apostle, the ultimate one sent out on a world-changing mission through the gift of faith and covered by his blood, all believers have been given this as a mission and a purpose. It is something we are called to until our last breath. We don't ever retire from it. We don't ever stop doing this. It begins thinking about who God has used in your own life to make an impact on you. Moving beyond the way the world tempts us to think about that initial question. And it begins with a desire to be that, to be more than just a churchgoer, but a desire to be a true disciple who wants to fulfill our call. And to be one who makes a lasting impact on other people, knowing we won't be fulfilled until we do. And knowing there is a special joy that can only come from this. And then it moves on to a relationship with prayer, a relationship with Christ through prayer, always relying on Christ to do this ministry, knowing that it is him who works in us and through us. And lastly, it is done in community with all kinds of people that you would not normally have rubbed shoulders with, but through the same forgiveness modeled in this group where tax collectors and zealots could be brought into the same redeemed community. If we want to be used to impact the world for Christ, or our church to be used or to make a difference, then this is what we must be called to. There is no other way. So let us begin by praying together, praying for each other, praying for ourselves, praying for our church, asking and seeking God to use us and use our church. You think about that.